Welcome to another episode of the Caroline Glick Show. MIke Benz, the executive director of Foundation for Freedom Online, was featured a couple of weeks ago on Tucker Carlson's show, talking about how the internet was transformed from the greatest commons, the greatest free speech forum in human history, into the largest censorship enterprise in human history. And I found the entire discussion intriguing from an Israeli perspective, but immediately after I watched the show, I contacted MIke Benz, who during the Trump years, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Communications and Information Technology, which is really like all the internet diplomacy of the United States government. And I contacted him immediately and I asked him whether he would be on the show and talk about it a little bit from the Israeli perspective. And he was nice enough to say yes, and we were able to schedule it for today. So first of all, I want to thank you for coming and welcome you, MIke Benz, to the Caroline Glick Show.
Thank you, Caroline. Great to speak with you.
Well, I was wondering, I'm not sure. I mean, many people watch the interview that you did with Tucker Carlson, but I'm not sure that all of my audience did. So can you just sort of walk us through for a second about what happened in 2014 and really how did it come about, what you saw as U.S. Government agencies really taking a knife to the concept of online free speech and beginning to exercise full-scale censorship through the social media platforms that we all use today.
Yeah, the internet had been a weapon of an instrument of statecraft is probably the best way to put it, since it had first been rolled out privately with the World Wide Web in 1991. Right from the outset, the U.S. government was funding free speech technology and was promoting free speech on the internet, not so much on First Amendment grounds, but on soft power projection grounds. The same way that after World War II ended and traditional empire building was collapsed under international law, you could no longer conquer territory by military occupation. You had to move into a sort of modality of political control. And so we created a CIA in 1948. We renamed our War Department to the Department of Defense, all oriented around this new emphasis on soft power, that is informational and economic and media control rather than hard power, meaning military control. And so, in the 20th century, we had many modalities of statecraft that were pumped in around the world. The CIA had things like Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty and Radio Free Asia and 800 different media proprietaries under the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency. And then there was a catch-up in those modalities throughout the 20th century as other countries began to develop their own internal programming and locked over control of state media. The internet, when it was made private in 1991,
so it's important. Can I stop you just one second? It's important because I think one of the aspects that people forget about with the Cold War is that it was very much also a war of ideas that the KGB, through the Comintern and through other agents of influence throughout the Western world, was working to decrease trust and support for Western values, Western institutions in Western societies. And then the mirror operation were things like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, et cetera, that were broadcasting behind the Iron Curtain to try to, bring a different message to the people there, right?
Totally. And let me also say, I am not casting moral aspersions on that work. You can make a very reasonable argument. There are many competing schools of foreign policy thought that say that was doing very positive work to counter communism. I think people on the other side might feel that was an overstep or manipulation. There's reasonable argument, I think, on both sides there. The issue is with the major events of geopolitical turbulence between 2014 and 2016, those tactics that were used first to take on fascism in the run-up to World War II and then to take on communism throughout the entire Cold War of the 20th century began to be turned on populism, domestic populism, that exact same
right. So
toolkit.
I interrupted you. So before you go to 2014, 2016, go back for a second to 91 until 2014. 2014, where we saw the development of the internet in a different way.
Right. So from 1991 to 2004, you had Web 1.0, which were things like forums and blogs and static websites. This was before the centralization of social media. And right away, you had the Defense Department, the NSA, the CIA, and the State Department highly active on this newly outbound global internet. So, for example, in the Tucker interview, I discussed the origins of Google. Google started as a company in 1996, but it started as a project of Larry Page and Sergey Brin, the two founders, as Stanford PhDs, where their PhD grant came from DARPA, the Pentagon's brain, as it's known. And it was a DARPA grant that was a joint CIA NSA grant for how to track birds of a feather flocking together on the internet with respect to how they traffic from search engines to static web pages. And so the original Google backbone architecture was essentially laid by the CIA and the NSA as they were tracking the rise and fall of political groups internationally. They wanted to create a kind of insurgency, counterinsurgency heat map based on how dissident groups discussed their politics on forums and web pages. And in addition to that, the State Department was the biggest fan of free speech because it was using USAID money and National Endowment for Democracy money to fund and to even train its own state-backed dissident groups in foreign countries so that they could overcome state-run media. If, say, you were in a country like China or Egypt where there was heavy state control over analog media, using these new forums that were untouchable because it was a worldwide web by the government was a way to coalesce a critical mass of movements to overthrow a government that was perceived to be hostile by the U.S. And the sort of in 2004, 2005, 2006, you had Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and then in 2007 you had the smartphone. And so that kicked off this social media age. And right away, you had the State Department create this new digital diplomacy doctrine around how to use social media and the centralization of that in the context of regime change and color revolutions. In the Tucker interview, I went through, the who's who character, arc of all that. It ended up coming right back to Google, where Google would create these, basically it was a State Department project that then Google turned into these AI censorship weapons, but it all culminated in the Arab Spring in 2011, 2012. This was sort of the high watermark of free speech diplomacy in the eyes of the State Department, where one after another, all of these Middle East, North African countries had their governments toppled in Facebook revolutions and Twitter revolutions. And so that was perceived to be sort of the halcyon era of free speech on the internet. It could do no wrong. And then within a few short years, there was turbulence on the free speech front as events like the Crimea annexation happened and the Ukrainian counter coup to the U.S.-led toppling of the Viktor Yanukovych government in Ukraine. And it was at that point, combined with a few other events, that the State Department began to say, hey, you know what? This free speech thing might not be an unalloyed good. We may actually
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
You dated to the Ukrainian unrest, the revolutions, the counter revolutions, etc. But you said the high watermark of this free speech on the internet was the Arab Spring. And here I'm wondering, Israelis and Saudis and other U.S. allies in the Middle East were aghast at what happened in the Arab Spring, because what happened in the Arab Spring is that you had the Muslim Brotherhood taking over Egypt and Tunis and other states, key states from everybody's perspective. Egypt is the most powerful, most populated, highest population Arab country, is 90 million people. And you're bringing in the Muslim Brotherhood, which is aligned with Al-Qaeda. And that was the product of the Google revolution in Egypt. But the Obama administration supported the Muslim Brotherhood government. So did that not lead to a reassessment? Maybe this is helping the most extreme elements inside of the Arab world, and this might not be a good idea, that wasn't part of the reconsideration of what was happening on the web?
Well,
They didn't see that as a problem? Because
this
you say Ukraine was the problem, and so I'm just wondering. I mean, from looking at it from Jerusalem, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, the ouster of America's most stable ally in the Arab world, Hosni Mubarak, that was.
Well, this gets to the intricate tango dance of how the U.S. foreign policy establishment works with extremist groups around the world. I mean, before in the 1970s, you can make an argument that Al Qaeda and ISIS, their origins were in the Mujahideen that were you had Zbigniew Brzezinski making personal trips, dangling himself out of a helicopter essentially to tell them that they were on a mission from God, and you're going to have limitless support from the U.S. Congress, and these are as fundamentalist groups as you can get. I mean, even what in the story in Ukraine is a great analogy as well. The Azov battalion was declared to be a neo-Nazi group. They were banned under the dangerous organizations policy of Facebook, Google, and several other platforms online. They were censured formally as Nazi groups by Congress in 2012 or 2013. And then suddenly, when they, because they were fundamentalist, because they were militaristic, because they were willing to carry out war against enemies of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, they became media darlings all over again. Their whole image was whitewashed. They were unbanned from Facebook. They had personal meetings with Chuck Schumer. It was inflatable extremism when it can be used as a battering ram to achieve an objective. And so I see the Muslim Brotherhood, sort of fundamentalism in that as part of that same lineage that has a long pedigree in U.S. statecraft. The issue is once you collapse this distinction between civilian and military control over media, you really lose everything that you think underpins the concept of democracy. The fact is democracy derives its legitimacy as government by consent of the governed. Well, if people can't even decide with their own hearts and minds because civilian media is controlled by the military class, I mean, this is the sort of thing that you would expect in North Korea or some sort of military junta state. This doctrine of hybrid warfare, this idea that you need to have the foreign policy establishment control domestic speech so that U.S. voters can't influence foreign policy. They can't change it. It reminds me of the sort of Pakistani hybrid governance model where the people can vote, on a prime minister who's allowed to determine, what the tax law is, or if there's a stop sign on one street or another, but can't decide anything related to military intelligence or foreign policy. That's for a separate permanent intelligence class. And that's really what's been constructed within the United States since at least 2016.
So, okay, so let's just talk for a second about what you were saying about Ukraine, and then more broadly the populist movements in Europe and in the West, and then rather than move to Trump and the United States and censorship of Americans, I kind of want to move back to the Middle East, so that we can touch on that a little bit because it is related. So, can you just walk us through?
Yeah. So, I think for purposes of this conversation, one of the most kind of interesting aspects of my discovery of sort of tracking the censorship industry for 8 years was, I initially thought of internet censorship in 2016 when I first came across this as being a sort of purely domestic, process where, it was a partisan political thing and it was bipartisan political actors and then tracing it up and up the chain, you would see that these institutions are the thought leadership that you see articulated at Facebook or YouTube was being sort of downstreamed from these larger consensus building institutions, places like the Atlantic Council, which billed itself as NATO's think tank. It's basically a barometer for the U.S. Intelligence Committee. They currently have 7 former CIA directors on their board of directors. A lot of people don't even know that 7 former heads of the CIA are still alive, let alone all concentrate on the board of one tiny little, think tank that's the main sort of thought leader in the censorship industry space. But it gets annual funding from the Pentagon, the State Department, and CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy. So this is a intelligence community consensus, government funded consensus building organization where, in 2016 and on, actually right after the Crimea annexation, 2014, they were one of the progenitors of this hybrid warfare from tanks to tweets concepts. And I would be listening into their live streams and reading their white papers, and there was this strange confluence between meetings around control over domestic populist politics in the U.S. and in Europe and Middle East energy policy. They would have these conferences on Russian disinformation and U.S. and European proxies for Russian disinformation. Groups like the Trump sort of movement in the U.S., the Brexit movement in the U.K., Viktor Orban in Hungary, political populist groups in Italy and Spain and Germany, all over. Many of which populist groups, including Bolsonaro in Brazil, that had a close affiliation with Netanyahu, with the Netanyahu government in Israel, at least on diplomatic grounds. There was this sort of nationalist populist alliance that was strongly burgeoning between 2016 and 2019. That was forming really the first ever. They were referring to it. The foreign policy establishment was referring to it as a sort of a new non-aligned movement. A group of sort of political neutrals during the Cold War who were proving themselves to be a nuisance to state, U.S. statecraft because they were not going along with the program. This was essentially how they were describing this nationalist populist axis that stretched from the U.S. Into Brazil and into Europe and into Israel. But what I thought was so strange about it is they would have these 8-hour conferences, and the first 2 hours would be Russian disinformation and how and how we need to stop it, and here's who we need to censor and how we need to do it, and how we need to create this whole society mobilization so that there's a government, private sector, and civil society and media, full spectrum alliance on this. Then that meeting would conclude, and there would be the same conference, and the very next set of panelists would be about the implications of Trump's policy on the Iran, on rolling back the Iran nuclear deal, and how we could get a backdoor. How we could basically get around, create a sort of Iran nuclear deal 2.0 in order to be able to, have NATO energy companies form partnerships to, with the export of, the world's number 3 and 4 respectively, exports of oil and gas. This was something they had been working on in the pre-Trump era very intensely. They had this maximum. The Biden world foreign policy establishment had this policy of maximum pressure on Russia, neutrality with Iran. Trump reversed that. Neutrality with Russia, by and large, and maximum pressure on Iran, which had a really nasty collateral impact on all of these investments that were being propped up in anticipation of the successful rollout of the JCPOA as its implementation was would be on a 2-decade rollout. So you had all of these investors. The Atlantic Council is a group that, again, is not just 7 CIA directors on its board. It's funded by energy and military contractors. It's all the major oil and gas companies provide annual funding to this same group. They were having these stakeholder meetings about how to stop the Trump policy on maximum pressure on Iran. There would be these recurring references to the sort of hostile point of view of the Likud party and other Netanyahu allies, and being hostile to opening up Iran. So I was sitting thinking, what is going on here? I thought this was just a story about domestic censorship of Americans. And what you're really seeing is this much larger plot involving everything from the Pentagon to the State Department to the CIA to the external, group of Chamber of Commerce companies to their financial investors in Wall Street and London, who are all terrified by the role of social media in being able to domestically elect nationalist populist politicians who might disrupt the profitable investments or long-term plans of essentially a syndicate of foreign policy stakeholders. And I think that the Netanyahu government ran headlong into that. And what we're seeing now with Chuck Schumer, the head of the U.S. Senate, calling for regime change and new elections in Israel, and then the very next day, the sitting president, Joe Biden, saying, I agree with Chuck Schumer's speech. He said nothing wrong. When the head of the Senate, by the way, who's ex officio on the U.S. on the Intelligence Committee, there was Chuck Schumer who said the intelligence community has 6 ways from Sunday to get back at you if you cross them. So it's Chuck Schumer, and if the head of the U.S. Senate, one of the only 9 people in the Democrat Party who's allowed to oversee the CIA, the president of the United States, are both echoing regime change in Israel. What do you think the Central Intelligence Director is doing? What do you think the State Department's working on in the background? And like I said, you knew all this stuff 6 years ago if you were just paying attention to Atlantic Council YouTube videos.
So let me just go back for a second, because you were saying that essentially you said it here, but you said it very crisply with Tucker, and I just want to sort of make sure that I got it right. You basically said that beginning around 2014, and then increasingly with Brexit and the rise of the AfD and in Germany, and like you said, Viktor Orban and other nationalist parties throughout Europe, that they started seeing these nationalist parties that are rising, and they were rising because people were talking to one another online, parties that were opposed to this kind of Atlantic Council view of things from get elected, and this freaked them out. And that's why they started then coming down very hard on specific groups and actors inside of domestic discourses across a range of Western countries. And it was that statement that really struck a chord with me in Israel, because I had that happen to me around the time that you're talking about. In 2015, we had elections here. And at that time, I was huge on Facebook. I don't know how it happened, but, it did. And every post, whether it was in Hebrew or in English, that I wrote on that platform was receiving, on average, over 100,000 views. And then all of a sudden, overnight, those numbers went down from 100,000 to 1,000. And then when I started building it back up and I was getting to 50,000 after like 6 months, it went down again to 1,000. So I realized there was it happened twice. It wasn't a fluke. It was a plan. And it wasn't just me. And I sort of was lucky because I wasn't banned. But all of these other Israeli conservative voices that had been prominent voices online, whether in Hebrew or in English, were getting shadow banned or deplatformed. People who were making their money on ads from Facebook and other things with their information platforms here were getting what's it called when they get deplatformed from the advertising, so they can't make any money on their demonetized. Right, that was where I was important. They got demonetized, and so all of these people on the Israeli right were getting censored in a big way by Facebook in particular, but I would assume by other platforms. That was just the one that I used at the time. And at the same time, in 2015, in the elections, we found out that the State Department was funding an organization called V15 that was running an anti-Netanyahu campaign, which was direct interference in Israel's election. They were also bringing Arab political parties to the United States for political training, for how to organize people to come out to get the vote, to get people to vote in the ballot boxes before the 2015 election. So we saw a very clear, aggressive censorship of Israelis on the right before the 2015 election, and then since then. And so that really struck a chord with me, and it went along with this 2013 exposure of a black ops budget for the State Department that was, I think, exposed with Snowden's theft of all the U.S. classified documents that said that Israel, it says that Israel I'm just quoting from an article at the time that I pulled up, that to further safeguard our classified networks, the United States, we continue to strengthen insider threat detection capabilities across the community. In addition, we are investing in target surveillance and offensive counterintelligence against key targets such as China, Russia, Iran, Israel, Pakistan, and Cuba. So during the Obama administration, again, they make Israel top intelligence target for the U.S. intelligence community. And then in 2014, 2015, they started massively censoring Israelis on the political right on Facebook. I don't know, I can't say that it was the U.S. government that did it, but it was these platforms, these major platforms, in particular Facebook, that was coming down very hard against Israeli conservatives. So that really struck a chord with me. Do you have any sense of those operations, of the operations specifically against people on the Israeli political right?
That timing lines up perfectly because it was 2015 when the JCPOA was ratified.
Right. In 2014 when it was being negotiated in
exactly.
secret.
Right. Yeah, and it had been being worked on for years, and they immediately identified the Netanyahu government as being the biggest blocker to that, because of the security concerns that Israel had about what would happen if, already you have, the militarism from Hamas and Hezbollah, with Iran under sanctions. If you were to relieve those sanctions and then, 30x the economy of Iran to be able to fund those proxy groups, that would be an overwhelming military catastrophe potentially for the state of Israel. And so Netanyahu obviously understood, that existential threat and tried to exert diplomatic counterpressure, which was a big blocker for the ability to get this done and the ability to protect it politically, post ratification. And so I find that timing to be very strange, that the very year that as that was happening was exactly when people perceived to be media allies of the Netanyahu government were being targeted for takedown. And again, this is right around the time, 2014, 2015 was right around the time when you had the U.S. foreign policy establishment look at the inverse of propaganda and focus on censorship. U.S. statecraft has always involved knob upturning of our own, foreign policy goals and values. And, you can call this not pejoratively, turning up our own propaganda, but the ability to do censorship in the analog era was very limited. You had to have the CIA would have to bribe a newspaper or extort a media personality or something. That was you can't really scale that. But with social media, it's if you simply have a liaison at Facebook to be able to do your bidding, it's one phone call or one email. And what you find is the heads of the trust and safety teams at Facebook and YouTube are former CIA folks. In fact, most of the top ranks are former CIA folks. At Facebook.
Has this been going on for a while? I remember that they were, when all of this was coming out, when Elon Musk bought Twitter, I was wondering whether that was a recent phenomenon or whether that's been happening all along. Do you know?
Well, I don't know if it was happening in the first 5 or 6 years of social media. It was. You did have these incidents of the State Department, making requests of social media companies, from 2004 through 2009, and then certainly the events of 2014, this hybrid warfare doctrine, part of that involved capacity building within the tech companies in order to create a conjoined infrastructure between the national security state foreign policy establishment and the tech companies themselves. So, for example, it was in 2014 when the first formal censorship office within the U.S. government was really created. This was something called the State Department's Global Engagement Center. This was created in 2014 by a guy named Rick Stengel. Rick Stengel was the former managing editor of Time magazine, and then he declared himself to be Obama's propagandist in chief. He was the undersecretary for public affairs at the State Department, which is the role that coordinates the State Department and the media. So it's, how you get this essentially, surround sound of media echoing State Department talking points is through the office that he ran. But he created a new office called the Global Engagement Center, which was set up so that the State Department, on foreign-facing affairs, so not affecting U.S. citizens or U.S. policy on U.S. soil, but could coordinate directly with the tech platforms for censoring things on the internet that were deemed to be hostile to U.S. national interests or were deemed to be a sort of terrorist threat or whatnot. So that was in 2014 when the first censorship office was set up within the State Department. And then, in 2018, DHS would create a domestic one. That's what's currently being litigated in the U.S. Supreme Court today, and the oral argument is this sort of domestic branch of that. But it was in 2014 when, the concept of fast, precise, and comprehensive internet censorship became a focus of study, after which essentially billions of dollars poured into the space, and it became an industry, that I term the censorship industry.
It's really weird because it's actually an internal and external thing when you think about it, because it was in 2014 that you had the IRS investigations of all the Tea Party groups, and it wasn't just the Tea Party groups. You also had audits and prohibitions on 501c3 accreditation to Z Street, which was a right-wing pro-Israel educational organization that was not, and they were told by the IRS that they were not given their 501c3 status because they were aligned with the Israeli right. And that was also ahead of the 2014 elections. And then you also had the Wall Street Journal exposed, I think in 2014, it might have been in 2015, that the NSA was being used against AIPAC officials who were coordinating their campaign against the JCPOA, and so that it was that the NSA wiretaps essentially that were exposed later as having been used against Trump and his team. I think it might have been during the election strike. I can't remember anymore what Lee Smith documented in his books, and then during the period from November 2016 to January 2017, that the precursor to that was actually the spying on American Jews who were opposed to the Iran deal. So that it's sort of like it all went hand in hand. I'm sort of stunned by the overall nature of it, because if you wanted to characterize sort of what the vision of people who are stifling, what are called nationalists, but I guess you could call them that, nationalist voices in the West and nationalist political movements in the West and in Israel, what do they want? I mean, why are they so anti-democratic? The people who are in a lot of these parties are extremely pro-Israel. I mean, all Israelis are, pro-American. Israelis in general are pro-American. Why would they? What is it that they want? What is their vision?
Well, the easiest way, as I see, is just to follow the money. Yeah, you have this situation. Take what's happening right now with the Biden world, diplomacy with Iran right now. You have this situation where I think the Biden State Department saw it as politically infeasible to try to reinflate the JCPOA. And so, there's this strange alliance with China. You had the fact that the Hunter Biden laptop emails were completely devastating on this issue. You had direct text messages from Hunter Biden where he talked about how his client was the spy chief of China, where the spy chief of China, he's telling his sister, that he's concerned about blowback from that. And, he's actively talking about, the China's, one of the emails is Hunter Biden pitching a portfolio of Chinese investors to buy up a liquefied natural gas port, an LNG port in Louisiana. So you've got these personal partnerships with Chinese energy mega firms like CEFC, China Energy, and you have literal, the White House first family partnerships with the spy chief of China. But how are they? What's happening with the Iran diplomacy right now to get around the reinstatement of sanctions? Well, in 2021, the first year of Biden's presidency, China and Iran signed a $400 billion joint security energy deal, where Iran is exporting $400 billion worth of oil and gas to China. Meanwhile, we know that China was partnered with the first family, at least in Hunter Biden's private capacity, but that probably touches the whole West Exec network and Atlantic Council network. I mean, it looks to me like they are using a sort of alliance with China as a backdoor Iran nuclear deal.
What West Exec?
Yeah, well, that was the incubator firm. That was the sort of shadow government, if you will. After the Obama administration, there was a firm called West Exec, which was set up as
I know.
Right, and that was Avril Haines and Tony Blinken and that whole network of blob creatures that is foreign policy establishment folks from everyone from the CIA to the Pentagon to the State Department, who were basically kept in cold storage after the Obama administration for the first term of the Trump administration, and then recycled through the revolving door immediately into senior positions in the Biden foreign policy establishment. It's that whole world, that's deeply connected to Hunter and the whole, Biden first family. And, so I see, in terms of what they want, in my view, you can answer it as simply as money. I mean, the fact is Israel's security interests stood in the way of this foreign policy faction's financial interests. And there's $1 trillion of natural gas, contracts on the line if you can open up, Iran and I mean, they sit on the world's number 3 and number 4 supplies, respectively, of oil and gas. Already, their exports have 10x'd just over the past 4 years. I think it went from something like $8 billion in sort of black market exports to, almost $100 billion just in 4 years without even having an Iran nuclear deal. And that's not even counting the China money. So, and again, that China money is partner money. I don't even see China as being an entity unto itself in that respect. It operates through partnerships with London and Wall Street stakeholders. And so, what I see here with this move to regime change Israel is just plain business for a bunch of bad actors within the U.S. foreign policy establishment.
It's interesting that you mentioned the reason why I stopped you on WestX is that was a firm that former Prime Minister Ehud Barak contacted when he was putting out his spyware tool Paragon as a competitor or replacement for Pegasus, the spyware that had been put out by other Israelis, and it was an Israeli company that was acting sort of to advance the diplomatic and strategic interests of Israel in the international markets. And it was blacklisted by the U.S. after the Biden administration, and Ehud Barak came to Avril Haines and Tony Blinken, etc., and Dan Shapiro, the former ambassador to Israel, was in part of this deal. And according to the Financial Times, he said to them, look, we will actually, instead of advancing the interests of Israel, we'll advance your interests. And so you should just use us. And they got a deal with the DEA at the same time that Kandera and NSO Group were getting blacklisted by the United States and blocked from international markets. So that's kind of, interesting. And he's in turn, he's been the leader really of the effort by Israel's elites to oust Netanyahu from power and has been one of the main funnels for financing for all the anti-government demonstrations here since the Netanyahu government came into power. But so it's sort of all wrapped in a nice bow, I guess.
Well, that's so fascinating because Avril Haines was the deputy CIA director under Obama. She was the number 2 at the CIA. And then she was again put in cold storage through the sort of West, exec thing. Then you're saying that's when Ehud Barak contacted her. What is she doing now? She's the head of the ODNI. She is the director of national intelligence. She is the
right,
CIA.
And they just put out this new report that said that there are going to be mass demonstrations in Israel to oust Netanyahu from power.
Right, but that means
earlier this week.
But Ehud Barak working with Avril Haines. Avril Haines is the boss of all bosses in the intelligence community now. She was promoted to that. So that's for better or worse.
I should be for it, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's how they get. Yeah, but that is really fascinating. You know, it's hard for me to imagine that all contact was cut off at that point. But that's a really fascinating anecdote. I didn't even know that.
So I think that we should probably round up this conversation. And I wouldn't mind if you would just give a little bit, because one of the things we jumped into the meat of it before we got to the bones, which is the structure of how this censorship network sort of works. So how did, like you said, that they opened up this global engagement center in 2007, but can you just end this conversation with me just sort of at the beginning? Like, what are we talking about? What is a censorship enterprise look like? How does that even work?
So the formal term that they use for it is whole of government, whole of society, which is this idea that censorship, that free speech on the internet is too big a challenge for any one aspect of society to take on its own. You know, they'll use a term like mis, dis, and malinformation. And of course, malinformation means true information, but that contributes to a misleading narrative. So it's not just false or deceptive content. It's true information that if people believe it will undermine public faith and confidence in something of concern to the foreign policy establishment. So this is, their formal term for it is, the whole of government, whole of society, counter mis, dis, and malinformation. But this was quarterbacked from basically from 2017 through 2022 in the Department of Homeland Security. It's now diffusing, and I can go through how it's restructured. But essentially, what the whole of society model is it's 4 categories of institutions who are fused together as a single one, and that's government institutions, private sector institutions, civil society institutions, and media institutions. Okay, so on the government side, they say whole of society, whole of government. That means every U.S. government agency that can contribute resources to countering mis, dis, and malinformation, which means censoring it. They don't mean counter speech; they mean flagging it to take it down. So that's everything from DHS to the FBI to the State Department to the Pentagon to the National Science Foundation to then the proprietary government agencies on any individual issue. So it'll be HHS for COVID censorship, or you name it. In the private sector quadrant, so that's the government quadrant. In the private sector quadrant, it's the tech platforms themselves. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, Discord, TikTok. All the different private sector companies. It's also the private censorship mercenary firms. These are groups like Graphica. These are, pop-up. These are groups who sell censorship products and services. And it's also the corporate social responsibility endowments of major blue chip companies who need favors from the U.S. government. So they partner on a favors basis. There's the third quadrant is civil society. And those are the universities, the NGOs, the foundations, the nonprofits, and then community leaders and activist groups who are all onboarded. So they will participate in these stakeholder meetings. There's over 60 U.S. universities currently getting U.S. government funding, over $100 million in government funding just to these 60 universities in order to do full-time censorship work. These are government grants and contracts, so they can function as part of this whole society network. And then the fourth category is media, which they refer to as news plus fact checking. And so these are like-minded, politically aligned media outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, Daily Beast. There's hundreds of these. There's, as well as the fact checking groups, which all get, these fact-checking groups, none of them are independent. The Poynter Institute, for example, is one of the biggest ones. It gets joint funding from the George Soros Open Society Foundation, and it's got, I think, 17 or 18 different State Department grants in order to use that fact-checking apparatus to manipulate elections around the world by getting populist groups censored. So these four categories, government, private sector, civil society, and news media, this is not my term for it. I literally took this directly from them because in 2017, at these stakeholder meetings that I was listening in on, they would talk about the need to create essentially a domestic analog for counterinsurgency tactics, because they viewed the rise of populism the same way as Islamofascism or communism, and that in order to be, what is our military doctrine for taking out political insurgency groups all around the world? Well, we need this axis of the government players in the region, the commercial players in the region, the media players in the region, and all the foundations and NGOs who are pumping soft power into it. And so that's the way it's structured here in the U.S. and in the UK and in Europe and all the different NATO countries where this has been established. And at their own stakeholder meetings, it reflects this. You will have joint panels where it'll be someone from the Department of Homeland Security and someone from the State Department. Sitting right next to them will be someone from the Trust and Safety team at Facebook, usually having previously worked for the CIA or the State Department or the Pentagon. And then sitting right next to them will be someone from an NGO, someone from the Atlantic Council or the German Marshall Fund or the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And sitting right next to them will be a Washington Post reporter who specializes in national security or intelligence. And they're all jointly coordinating. And then there'll be follow-up white papers, and then there'll be policy proposals, and then there'll be government grant applications. And then it will filter its way into, talking points from Chuck Schumer or from State Department officials. This is the consensus building architecture, and it ties together every aspect of our society in order to have a full spectrum surround sound on what you can say and what goes viral on the internet.
That's an amazing thing. I think we should probably stop it there, because otherwise we're going to go on for 4 hours, which would be fine with me, but I'm not sure how large our viewership would be if they saw that this was a 4-hour video. But listen, Mike, I guess in the event that there's a second Trump administration, hopefully you would get a position to stop this. But I hope that just forewarned is forearmed, and when we look at the kinds of things that are being done in a censorship dominant world today, that we have to really value our vote. We have to really protect that and make sure that our governments are chosen by voters, and look forward to a future where our say won't be squelched and smothered by the internet platforms that our lives are really dependent on in so many different ways today. So I appreciate very much you shining the light on this, and also that you working, helping me to figure out what is going on here in terms of the thumb on the scales that's been pushed into a fist over the past couple of weeks in Israel. I hope that all of us working together are going to be able to fix this somehow or another. I don't know.
Well, thank you, Caroline, for your time. I think that we've got a lot of momentum right now in terms of exposure. And, even the New York Times just yesterday lamented the impact of folks like Stephen Miller and everyone being able to score a number of victories in the past 12 months that were thought to be impossible 24 months ago. So, our job is to keep that momentum going and keep the wind in our sails. And I appreciate everything you're doing and your important voice on all this.
I will take care, and God bless you. And we may have you back again as the chips fall where they may. I'm sure that you'll be playing a role, holding them or dropping them one by one, as the case may be. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Carol.